From the New York Times, this is The New Washington. I'm Michael Barbaro.
Premiums will rise in the individual market as a result of the Senate bill.
No. Let me, and this is an example of where we've got to get our facts straight.
That's my point.
Well, we need to fix Obamacare. We've got an Obamacare emergency in the state of Tennessee. I agree with President Trump that we should replace and repeal major parts of Obamacare at the same time.
I don't think there are 40 votes to repeal and say to the American people, well, trust us to come up with something in the next couple of years. I don't think that's a good idea.
You don't think there are even 40?
I don't think so.
There are a number of issues with the American healthcare system, Mr. President. But if your house is on fire, you want to put out the fire. And the fire in this case is the individual health insurance market.
7, 8, 9, 10. 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20.
Carl Hulse, who did you talk to this week?
Senator Lamar Alexander, Republican of Tennessee, longtime public servant, I guess I would say.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10.
I honestly don't know much about Lamar Alexander. I only know his name. Why is this the first person that you wanted to talk to?
Well, he'll be hurt that you don't know much about him.
I know his name.
I actually think that Lamar Alexander right now is one of the most important people in Washington. Right now, he is in charge of trying to salvage something out of the healthcare mess debacle, whichever word you want to apply to that.
As the president said, this is more, nobody knew how complicated this was. Well, he may have been the only person who didn't know that because it's very complicated. It involves nearly 300 million Americans, many different points of view, and it's very personal.
And the interesting thing about him is that he's trying to do it in a way that is almost unheard of in Washington these days. He's being unashamedly bipartisan.
I'm consulting with Senator Murray to try to make these hearings as bipartisan as possible and to involve as many committee members as possible.
Brazen idea.
It is really something to see.
So we've got this Republican from Tennessee who 6 months ago
What we want to do is to
wanted to repeal and replace.
reform and replace Obamacare and then repeal the provisions of it that have damaged so many Americans.
He voted with his party for every repeal or replace vote that he could have possibly voted for. Now he's, as you are describing it, being unashamedly bipartisan in this effort to fix it. So I want to hear how he explained that journey to you, from repeal, dump, get rid of it, to salvage it.
You were one of the advocates for, we will repeal it, but we got to replace it with something. And that's sort of when things started to divide the Republican Party a bit. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I would, but my feeling was, most pilots like to know where they're going to land before they take off, and there was a time when we could perhaps repeal the Affordable Care Act and say we'll take the next couple of years and replace it. But not today. I mean, today we've got an urgent problem. In many counties, in many states, you have the real prospect that there'll be millions of Americans with no insurance policies to buy. They might have a government subsidy, but the insurance company might have pulled out because of what the Tennessee insurance commissioner calls a collapsing market. So the government subsidy would be like a bus ticket in a town with no buses. And then
the senior senator from Arizona is recognized.
I thank you, Mr. President. I've stood in this place many times and addressed as president many presiding officers.
So during that final dramatic week of these last-ditch efforts to repeal the healthcare law, Senator John McCain gives his speech.
Let's trust each other. Let's return to regular order. We've been spinning our wheels on too many important issues because we keep trying to find a way to win without help from across the aisle.
What does Alexander say about McCain's speech, this kind of rebuke that McCain delivers to Congress? Because it sounds in many ways like a call for exactly what Alexander is doing now.
I think Senator Alexander agrees with a lot of what John McCain said, that the Senate's not getting anything done and they need to work together. I mean, this is what Senator Lamar Alexander is about.
I mean, I heard a Supreme Court justice say last week, a couple of weekends ago, somebody asked him how why people of such different views as Thomas and Ginsburg get along. And he said, we try to remember that the Constitution and the institution are more important than any of our opinions. And it encouraged me to do more of what I try to do anyway, which is to make this institution, the United States Senate, work better. I mean, we've got a fractured country. This is the most important institution for creating a consensus on tough issues like healthcare, like civil rights, like elementary and secondary education, and we need to function. And I think most of us understand that. I mean, there's some very talented people here in the United States Senate. I mean, if we sent out a Rhodes Scholarship Committee to interview people, they'd come up with a lot of people who are here. But it's like a team of all Americans that's not winning many games, and we need to play better.
Lamar Alexander has quite a folksy lexicon.
Yes. In his office, we did this interview in his office in the Dirksen office building. It's full of Tennessee knickknacks, including a guitar made out of matchsticks by a prison inmate hanging on the wall. It's really quite impressive, Michael.
Here's what we're trying to do. And
I want to talk about what exactly Alexander and these other senators are up to with this bipartisan fix. What do they actually want to do?
It's not a very complicated thing. They want to fund the cost-sharing payments.
Let me be specific about it. There are 350,000 Tennesseans who buy in the individual market. I mentioned these are songwriters or self-employed people who don't get their insurance on the job or they don't get it from the government. And here's what they face next year, in 2018. The insurance companies might have pulled out and they might not have a policy to buy. Or premiums and deductibles may have gone up so high they can't afford it. So our goal is to have hearings and come to a consensus by mid-September that would stabilize that individual market and make policies affordable for people like the 350,000 Tennesseans, which means millions of Americans across the country. I think we can do that. I think Democrats and Republicans agree that that market, where 6% of Americans get their insurance, is in trouble, and we need to fix it. Once we do that, and it might be a very simple fix, might only be a couple of things, then we can take the second step and tackle bigger issues.
Now, this is not going to be easy at all, and I'm not even sure it's possible, Michael, because there has been no bipartisan approach on the Affordable Care Act. And first, he has to get it through his committee.
You mentioned the committee that I chair with health, education, labor.
His committee is pretty interesting because it's diverse as Rand Paul, the libertarian from Kentucky.
From Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren. Patty Murray, the senator from Washington, is the senior Democrat.
So you got to bring those together. But Susan Collins and Lisa Murkowski are there too.
So you can see that it might be difficult to do anything in the committee, but we do a lot.
So you have to get the committee first. Then you have to get the Senate. And then if you get the Senate, then you have to get the House. And I see that as being very, very difficult. There's much more resistance to any plan to prop up Obamacare in the House than in the Senate. And, you know, the conservative advocacy groups are going to be all over this. They've already come after Senator Alexander. They see this as an insurance company bailout, and bailouts are bad politics. So it's going to be a tough sell.
It would seem to be a dramatic turnaround from, as you just recalled, where we were basically where the two parties wouldn't even look at each other over this subject. So, I mean, is this a serious effort that Alexander is
I do think it's a serious rescue effort. I do think that. I don't know that he can succeed. You know, it's nice to watch somebody try to do this for once. He has another secret relationship in the Senate. He's very close to Mitch McConnell. They're friends.
A man who, if you Google the word bland, Google prompts you with, did you mean Lamar Alexander?
I think Senator McConnell is kind of stepping out of the way here, letting Senator Alexander try this and see what it can produce. But Alexander does have good connections with the Republican and the Democratic leader. Maybe that's a leg up for him. But this is a tough job.
Do you think McConnell could actually support this?
Well, that's a lot of forecasting. Supporting is one thing. Allowing something to happen is another thing.
You can step back and just let.
Yes.
Let it
Like,
let it
well,
unfold.
I might not be for that, but if this is what the will of the Senate is right now, well, go ahead.
I think that, yes, I would like to say by the end of the year.
Unbelievably complex subject. Nobody knew that health care could be so complicated.
Referred to that bill as, quote, mean.
Mean, that was my term.
Great if we get it done, and if we don't get it done, it's just going to be something that we're not going to like.
Carl, you asked Senator Alexander about President Trump's role in the healthcare debate.
The job of the president really is to persuade at least half the people we're right. And right now, he's persuading about a third of the people. So the better he does in creating an environment for success, the easier it is to pass the bill.
So has he created that environment?
Well, not as well as I would like. He's got a tough job.
The president is now talking about finding ways to sink Obamacare every day. And we've talked about this with you, Carl.
Yeah.
Threatening to turn off the subsidies, threatening to find a creative way in which to collapse it. So this puts Alexander essentially as the leader of something that seems directly at odds with the president and the leader of his party. So what does that mean?
I think you've characterized it correctly. We'll see if Trump comes after him and what kind of trouble this gets him in. I haven't seen the president directly attack Senator Alexander yet to this point, but it could come to that. But it could be also the White House looks at that and goes, well, this might be something we want to look at, and because it can get us out of a big problem if this thing really goes down and we start to get the blame.
So to that point, is this an act of political bravery by Senator Alexander, and is it potentially an act of political self-immolation?
I think that he is, I think he's doing what he thinks is the right thing. And you can be the judge of whether that's courage or pragmatism. I asked him, I said, well, why? Okay, you want to do this? I'm a Republican sitting out in the Midwest somewhere. I'm looking at this and I go, oh, here's Lamar Alexander. He was for repeal, and now he's trying to save Obamacare.
Right.
How can that be? And he said,
I would say to that Republican, look, I voted for the Senate bill to repeal and replace. I voted for the House bill. I voted for another Senate bill to repeal and replace. And I would vote for the bill that's floating around that would be a block grant to repeal and replace. But what about 2018? We've got to deal with that by mid-September, and you're not going to think very much of me if I come up here and all I do is argue and never get a result.
Right.
He's a guy who wants to get something done. And that's not always the sentiment in Congress these days.
Right. He seems more bothered by the notion that voters might think he's ineffectual and uninterested in getting things done than he is by the worry of, I guess, betraying a Republican voter and his or her ideology.
I would agree with that.
Alexander explains what he's up to now by saying that working together in a bipartisan way is
so that's the best way to do things.
how
And when
the
we
most
do things
important
in a
and enduring
bipartisan
things
way,
get done in
lasts.
Washington. And that's a nice thought.
The Civil Rights Bill was controversial in the 60s, but nobody was trying to repeal it after it passed because it was bipartisan. So it'd been better to be bipartisan.
But it seemed
but
to
we
me
had
a little
such
bit
differences of opinion.
like a contradiction. Isn't that a very different message than the one we're hearing from Republicans like Alexander even a couple of weeks ago?
Yeah, but I think that the truth in that statement, both sides will say this, and even Mitch McConnell would say that the only way you do big legislation that lasts is for both sides to do it. If it's just one side does it, and we're seeing it right now, if just one side does it, then when the other side comes to power, they immediately try to undo it. You have to, what he's saying is that the history of the Senate and the Congress is if you're going to do these big things, there has to be buy-in from both sides. One, so they both support it, and two, so they both own it. You have to do it that way. But it is different because this place is sort of a mess right now.
But like you asked him, and it was a really smart question, why not just start with the bipartisan fix? Why go through all of the machinations of partisan warfare first?
Wouldn't it have been better just to start out and say, listen, we need to fix this thing?
Well, maybe, but that's like saying, wouldn't it have been better if the defensive back had just been about 3 yards to the left and had intercepted the pass and Tennessee had won the game? Yeah, it might have been better, but that wasn't the way it was. The Democrats started out by cramming the bill down the Republicans' throats in 2009 and 10. I mean, I was here on a cold Christmas Eve, Harry Reid wrote a bill in his office, brought it out. We had 2 or 3 days to consider it, and they passed it with 60 Democratic votes and no Republican votes, and we've been arguing ever since.
Yeah, politics, you know. The Republicans have used this as a weapon for years, and their first effort out of the box just wasn't going to be, oh, okay, we'll repair this. I agree that probably would have been the best way to do it, and even he agreed that that might have been the best way to do it. But that wasn't the way it was done, you know, because they've been at war over this thing. This, to me, is one of the first attempts to sort of get past that conflict, but we'll see how it goes.
So after you and Lamar Alexander talked about healthcare, you talked briefly about another big story in Washington this week, which was the White House's decision to take on affirmative action. And he told you an interesting story along the way.
Right. He talked about his own upbringing and that he had pushed for open enrollment of blacks at Vanderbilt, the Nashville University that he attended when he was the editor of the paper, and the student body voted it down.
Right.
So your views even then weren't popular with some of your peers. What do you attribute the position you had on that to? Where did your own views on race develop?
I grew up in a small town in Maryville, Tennessee, outside the Smoky Mountains. In fact, a New York Times reporter, when I was running for president, wrote that Mr. Alexander grew up in a lower middle-class family at the edge of the mountains. And when I called my mother the next weekend, she was livid about that. And she said, we never thought of ourselves that way. You had everything you needed. You had a library card from the day you were 3 and a music lesson from the day you were 4. You had everything you needed that was important. And that same mother resigned from the DAR, the Daughters of the American Revolution, when they wouldn't let Marian Anderson sing at Constitution Hall in 1938. So I guess it came from there. And when I was governor of Boise State at age 17, and that was 1957, a long time ago, they sent me a copy of my remarks, and I was afraid to see what I might have said at age 17. But one thing was to outlaw the Ku Klux Klan. So 1962, I was a senior at Vanderbilt, and Vanderbilt was still segregated based on race in the undergraduate school. It's hard to realize that a prestigious university like that would be, looking back. And I said it was embarrassing and we should change it, and in fact provoked the referendum where the student body voted it down, but the Board of Trusts of Vanderbilt decided to change the policy that year.
So, you know, you saw this little thing from the Justice Department this week. They're talking about maybe taking aim at provisions, affirmative action provisions. What would you think of that?
Well, I was asked that as education secretary. I think whenever in our country you begin to make distinctions based on race, you get into trouble. Distinctions based on income, sure. I mean, if you have a young white person or a black person or a Latino person with no money and you create a scholarship program for our low-income people, I think that's very much in the American spirit. But anytime you steer into government policy that favors one race over another, I think that flies in the face of this e pluribus unum principle that we are all Americans. And it's tempting to do it sometimes, but as a long-term policy, I don't like it. And it leads to divisions in a country at a time when we don't need more divisions.
Carl, what should people be paying attention to over the next few weeks when it comes to Lamar Alexander? What should they be watching for?
Well, I mean, this committee, let's watch this committee when they come back. Let's watch whether they can get anywhere. Let's watch what Mitch McConnell or John Cornyn, these Senate leaders, say. If they say this is going nowhere, we can't get behind it. There'll be lots of hints and signs, I think, of whether this is going to work or not.
Got it. And when do they come back?
Beginning of September. So since I have the chance, I want to apologize on behalf of the New York Times to your mother for mischaracterizing your family. And thank you so much for doing this. It was really interesting, and I think people will get an idea where we're headed on healthcare.
Thank you, Carl. Nice to talk with you.
Carl, thank you.
Thank you, Michael.
The New Washington is produced by Michael Simon Johnson and Michaela Bouchard. Brad Fisher is our engineer. Lisa Tobin is our executive producer. Samantha Hennig is our editorial director. Our theme music is by Jim Brunberg and Ben Lansford of Wonderly. Special thanks to Sam Dolnick and Lindsay Garrison. That's it for The New Washington. See you back here next weekend.